Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of our podcast series, The Edge. I will be flying solo today. My podcast buddy, Mr. Spieler, is not available. So I'm still going to do this anyway, and let's see how it goes. Today, I'm very happy that I've got Mr. Jim Tiller here to talk to me. So, Jim, as I do with every one of these podcasts, my initial question is going to be kind of give me a little bit of background. How did you get started, and how did you end up with where you are today?
Sure. First of all, thanks for having me on, Jay. I really appreciate it. I'm really excited about this. Love the podcast. Long time listener, shall we say. I actually started in the very early 90s. I guess I want to say 92, 93-ish. It really just started as working at a company where I learned through various processes that we had essentially been hacked, I guess, lack of a better term. And I was investigating, well, how did this come to be? How did this materialize? And at the time, I was what I considered quote unquote my second career when I was getting into mechanical engineering and civil engineering. And I wanted to be an architect, all that kind of stuff in the late 80s, early 90s. And, but we were, I was building computer networks and writing software for AutoCAD because we were using a lot of CAD systems. And I was running a CAD department. And anyway, I started looking into how this happened, and I was like, well, wait a second. So I essentially started what we call pen testing today, pen testing the network to try to figure out where and what happened and how it happened. And that's when I fell in love with Unix as an example. And then it just sort of blew up from there. I realized, wait a second, I got a knack for this, kind of the pen testing side of things. And then I went and did security for a couple enterprises in what I would consider a relatively junior level. We didn't really, not a lot of people were doing security in the enterprise back then at all, in 92, 93, 94, 95 kind of period. And so then I got into consulting. So I started working with like companies like Checkpoint, in early versions of their firewall and helping companies. I remember, implementing, FRAC T1s and putting in DMARCs, and they were like, okay. And they would plop in an old 2500 Cisco router. And they're like, okay, we're done. I'm like, yeah, you're not done. You're connected to the internet now. All you've done is open yourself to all kinds of problems. And then one thing led to another. And I just started basically doing consulting work. That's literally how it started in the technology space. And then short time after that, next thing like HIPAA and BS 7799 was coming out. And so I really started embracing the concept of risk. And that's when I really formed my core opinions on the concept of threat-based defenses, if you will, threat-based security programs. And ironically, I got to say it is the concept of what we call today zero trust, right? And so I've never been a fan of the word trust in technology anyway. But yeah, so that's how I got into it. Start off as, almost by accident. We were hacked and I needed to figure out why. And I've been chasing that problem since day one.
So I've noticed. I mean, I was stalking you a little bit earlier on LinkedIn, as you do, kind of doing a bit of prep work, and I noticed that you've been kind of a CISO for a number of different companies. I think you were at HP for a while. You were at Optiv for a while. Is there a kind of do you have to deal with those kind of CISO roles differently if you're at say what I would call a vendor, or if you're in the enterprise? Well, how do you think that's different, and is it different?
I mean, I know we chatted about this briefly, but just before the show they are different, but amazingly the same. For example, when, shall we say, talking to organizations about particular employment, they would go, well, you're not really a CISO. You've done security. You were running security consulting at HP as an example. And what I find ironic about that is I was at that level, even though I was running a consulting organization made up of, a couple hundred professionals across HP here in the Americas. I was interfacing at the highest levels of our client community and helping to define strategy and approaches and a programmatic approach. And I didn't really like that. In early career, I was very project oriented, as a consultant, as would be. And I realized that there's not a lot of satisfaction necessarily in being kind of coming in, doing an assessment and leaving. I wanted to be part of that path. I wanted to be on the journey with organizations. And so I started basically selling and positioning and delivering bigger and bigger projects, pretty soon running bigger teams. Teams led to smaller organizations led to really big ones. And so I was able to help, organizations like British Telecom and help work at organizations like Hewlett Packard or Lucent or Bell Labs and begin to create these capabilities. And then I really worked on building deep relationships with organizations to help them take this on this journey. So, and as a CISO, today, as the global CISO for Nash Squared, which is basically an umbrella organization for a number of brands in the mostly out of the UK, is you're able to really kind of take that journey from its very onset and really kind of embrace, the culture of the company and really embrace all the moving parts, and that's exciting. So the big difference is in one instance, I work with a lot of organizations around strategy and things. And a CISO, you just work with one, but you get a much deeper level of involvement in that as well. So they're very different, but at the same time, security is, you know, security is who I brought to the dance, and I just keep dancing, right? So it's always the core of my being.
I think, to be honest, I mean that's a whole, like, I'd love to talk with you about CISOs in general, but maybe that's a conversation for another podcast, because there's a kind of direction I want to take this in, and I think I could easily talk about CISO and reporting lines and what the role of the CISO is and all of that. So maybe we
Sure.
jump on and we do another one. But I'd like to circle back a little bit about, you mentioned zero trust, and obviously that's a huge topic in the industry right now. You've got things like zero trust, you've got SSE, SASE, you've got all of these buzzwords, and I'd really like to try and get your opinion on those, because I have my opinion. I tend to think that the analysts kind of invent these to kind of maybe to get paid or whatever it works out to be, and I can see some value in them, but it's been around for a while. I mean, to go back to your comment about kind of being a CISO, I think you were a CISO before that it was really a title. We've spoken to people on the podcast like Paul Simmons, and he was kind of what he would class as an original CISO back in the day, and there weren't very many. So it's one of those where zero trust is similar to that. Zero trust started getting talked about long before I even had heard of it. I mean, many, many years ago. And I think it's came back into the forefront of talk again, maybe because of the analysts, maybe because of the work John Kindevag's doing, or because of the pandemic, or because people are now actually starting to see there is something behind it and it makes sense. But I'd really be interested in what your opinion is.
So let me start by saying I don't think zero trust is necessarily a buzzword. I think it's a real thing. So one is we have to, be mindful of the dangers of putting it, compartmentalizing it as just something. It's like, oh, what if? I think the main difference is before the term zero trust became what it is, right? Mostly back in 2010 with, key articles that were written and books that preceded it is the fact of the matter is sometimes it was just too nebulous conceptually about how to build a means by which to organize how people are accessing our systems or applications or APIs, you name it, how things are interacting with information systems and various capabilities. So, I mean, I remember vividly being just totally threw myself into things like certificates and PKI. I was a huge PGP fan in the beginning. And then I really kind of jumped right into smart cards, very in the early days. I mean, think about companies like Schlumberger that were doing smart cards in the late 70s and 80s. And so we were, implementing smart cards. My whole point there was to have a greater bonding agent between the user of the smart card, the systems, and ultimately translating that to what they were using from that. So we were speaking in these terms, but it was extraordinarily complex. It was at best theoretical in some cases. So, I say when I say that, people who were in the space at that time were thinking in these types of terms. We didn't really have a way of explaining it. I mean, even security itself has gone through its own changes. I remember in the early days, we called it, it's security. And then we didn't want to get confused with, guards and gates. So we called it information security. And then now next thing you know, we say cyber and everybody immediately thinks of cybersecurity, right? So I think by giving it a name, it actually quantifies it and makes it easier to talk about. So yeah, I mean, are people marketing it? Are people, jumping on the bandwagon, lack of a better term? I think in many ways it's because now we're at a position where the industry, the IT world, the business world has a much more better understanding of technology. I mean, the early days of technology, only kind of, let's just be honest, people like you and I, we were the guys in the corner back of the building that knew how everything worked. Everybody was just struggling to figure out sending how to email. Nowadays technology is everything. So I think there's an inherent awareness of the importance of identity and importance of logging in and passwords and MFA and all that kind of stuff. So it's been around for a long time. It is absolutely not nothing new, but giving it a term and giving it something that gives people a conduit to speak across multiple communities, that's the advantage. That I try to see the positive spin, let's say, of what a coined phrase can help us do. So it is very real conceptually. And I think now whether we get there or not, that's a whole other discussion, right? So.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with you. I mean, it was kind of pre-pandemic that zero trust became a thing for me. And before, I mean, I was in a manufacturing company, and I started to think about segmenting the network a bit because we had to. There were things in place we had to abide by, that we needed to kind of segment OT equipment off and stuff like that. So I didn't like using the old kind of ACLs and NAC because they come with problems, and they're prone to human error. So I started kind of going out and looking at tools to segment the network. And then I started thinking, okay, we really need to connect users just to applications, like, because then it resolves the whole kind of them being on the network and being able to go anywhere. And then the more I kind of got intrigued by it, the more I did research, the more I looked into it. I'm like, oh, this is zero trust. Like, this is a thing. And it's funny how it didn't come over to the UK for quite a while. And even now, there's a lot more going on in the US. I think there's a lot more talk. There's a lot more events about zero trust, but I am seeing it kind of pick up in the UK. So I definitely think it's not a product, it's a strategy. And it doesn't involve just technology. It involves people in process and cultural changes, which, to be fair, kind of leads me on to how we ended up really talking initially. Was I saw an article of yours that you wrote, and if I remember rightly, it was about kind of there being a resource issue within the cyber community, and we had a conversation about that. And there's a number of things I want to talk about. I want to talk about that as one, like why is there really a resource issue, and kind of a little bit about diversity and a little bit about those kind of things. So let's start with, I guess, your opinion on the whole issue of is there actually a resource issue? I mean, I see on LinkedIn an awful lot of people looking for jobs, and I see a lot of people advertising jobs. Why can't we get the two kind of to mix? I mean, you know much more than me, but is there really an issue with resources?
So I'm going to give you kind of a tactical response, and I'm going to speak sort of very ethereal for a moment. Okay. So I say I can reach out and reference reports that speak to how many jobs are unfilled. And, these are well publicized in various ways. Just Google it, you'll see them. But there's also been some recent surveys about people who are in the industry today. And I read a report recently that spanned, I think it was like 17 countries, and 3,000 or 5,000 people were surveyed. And people who'd been in on an average of 7 to 8 years in the industry said they were going to 22%, I think, were going to quit within the next year or 2 years. So now, so there's a gap, but it's also increasing. And I think it's because of a couple of reasons. One is, which I'll get to more theoretical later on, is what does it mean to be a security professional and how to quantify that? Believe it or not, I'm going to talk about that. But I think also is there's a bit of a tendency, there was a sort of a rush, if you don't mind me saying, into the cyber world. So it became very, very important. People could see, wow, I can make more money, right? So we saw sort of an influx, a lot of, shall we say, people who mostly in the IT space kind of becoming more security savvy. And so now you have a lot of people. And then what I've seen, unfortunately, in some cases is people taking on a security role and maybe didn't realize that there's a knowledge gap there, right? They may have, maybe, lack of a better term, oversold or wasn't fully prepared. And so we have a lot of, shall we say, people identify themselves as security experts, mostly through certification as an example, which is a whole discussion. And then people hiring these security people, and they're like, well, wait a second, my security's not improving. I'm not seeing things progress necessarily. So we have a weird dynamic. Now, on a more esoteric level, if that's a good word to use here, is we, unfortunately, the cybersecurity industry, for reasons I don't think are replicated elsewhere, but there are nearly 500 cybersecurity certifications, and we have as an industry, as professionals, may have not have done the greatest job in the world of expressing our skills and capabilities across the full spectrum. So these certifications materialize, just like regulations are coming from all forms, standards. I mean, I lost count. NIST has so many SB 800s, they moved to SB 1800 kind of thing, right? So, I mean, there's just so many different opinions and approaches and structures behind it. So we've been communicating what our abilities are through certification. You flip that over, and now you're the consumer looking to acquire security professionals, and you're not really sure how to articulate what you really need to get done because security is this nebulous, ever-changing thing. So you go, well, I kind of need this. Is there a certification for it? And so you have this market driving certifications because they need it to articulate what they need. And then you have this, the shall we say, the supply side trying to figure out what's the best certification to get me the right job. And somewhere in the middle is the business and the human, right? The business is looking, trying to accomplish something, obviously, and security is part of that discussion. It's not the discussion. It's very important we understand that. And you have people, individuals that are trying to build a career and want to do so in a way that makes them happy and fulfilled in a profession. And unfortunately, it's very difficult to navigate that in security, right? Is it technical? Is it risk-based? Is it compliance-based? Is it a SOC operations person, a threat intel person? So in some ways, certifications have become that thing. So getting back to the core of your question, is there a gap? I think yes, but it's not as simple as we just need to train more people. I think it is we need to be better at articulating what businesses need and aligning resource capability to their security strategy. Very few organizations do that. They create a security strategy and they go, well, now I need skills to figure that out. And then I think on the supply side, the professional side is we're always trying to figure out, okay, what's kind of the next coming, what's the next coolest thing that, makes me tick, and can I make money doing that, right? So the skills gap is a very multidimensional problem. And then, of course, add to that sort of the whole concept around burnout, which I sort of alluded to earlier in that one survey. It's a very interesting condition.
Yeah. So one of the things that I've certainly found in the past is I've gone for interviews. I've sat down with the person interviewing me, and they don't know what they want. I mean, and I've sat there and in fact, several years ago now, I guess 5 or so years ago, I got interviewed by a company all the way up to the top. I mean, we went through 6 or 7 rounds of interviews. I did panel reviews. I got all the way to the top, and there was a discrepancy between what I've been told they were going to pay me and what I was actually going to get paid. And what they actually expected of me. So I ended up kind of giving them free consultancy and sitting with them, writing down what I thought they needed and why, and then sitting in on interviews to actually fill the role. And one of the things that I said to them was, you need to kind of really understand what you're looking for. Don't just throw a net out there and try and get everybody, because you're going to waste a lot of people's time, and it's time, and time's money. I mean, I was on and off the train into London several times to go to these interviews at a cost of hundreds of pounds. And they did that to a lot of people, and they were interviewing for about 18 months before they kind of interviewed me. So I'm like, you really need to know what you want, and you really need to know what you're going to pay as well, because you can't just like go for a process of 4 or 5 interviews and then be wildly off. I mean, I understand a business needs to make money, but it's just crazy. But I guess that kind of leads me on to diversity in it. And we briefly talked about this in the past, but it's a topic that is a delicate one to talk about, and specifically delicate, I think, for 2 white middle-aged men to talk about.
100%.
Because I've worked in IT/security/infosec, whatever we want to call it, pretty much all of my life. I came out of university, I got a job on a support desk, and I worked my whole career. And every single training course I've been on, and I've been on quite a lot, it would be very unusual to have, firstly, a female in the room, and certainly a person of color. It was very unusual. And I obviously I'm in the UK. I don't know what it was like outside of that. But what I'm seeing now is there is a diversity across all of those areas. And it's really good, because I've managed teams, and everyone in that team might as well have been a clone of each other. They were all so similar that when a problem came up, in a way it was easy because everyone tackled the problem in the same way. There was no discussion. There was no investigation. It was like, oh, this is the problem, this is the solution, because everyone was a clone. However, that solution might not have always been the same or the right solution. What I saw through diversity is people think differently. They bring different ideas to the table. They come from different cultural backgrounds, or they're a different sex, or whatever it may be. And therefore, they have a different idea. They have possibly a different solution or a different way to come to a solution. And although that may cause, in some ways, conflict, because there'll be a discussion instead of just going straight down the same road. I mean, it's almost like you get to a roundabout and it's like, which way do I go? Whereas before it was just a straight road, everyone went in the same direction. But I'm really happy to see, and certainly now when I go on online and do cyber courses online, whether they're virtual or not through the pandemic, or whether I go to physical events like Black Cat or RSA or those things, there's a wider range of people. I'd be curious to know what you think about that. Is it similar in the US, or are you? And I know that you help people get jobs, and you kind of fit people to jobs. Are you seeing things changing? Have they changed?
I would say the awareness is at a point where we're starting to see an influx of change. I think some elements of it are, I don't want to use the word draconian, but I think there's this overwhelming intensity to drive diversity, which is positive at its core. But so let me back up for a second. First of all, it's a global phenomenon, obviously. So so what I see in the UK, or I just recently got back from Europe, and obviously here in the United States, the conversations are very common. I take a very very core simplistic view at diversity, and I want to start by saying, for those that are out there that are, shall we say, middle-aged white guys like us, um, we have to recognize that the world has changed in technology to the point where it's become more a part of people's lives. I mean, there was a time when, whether a woman was in the room or somebody of color in the room, in a room full of guys talking about, IT or IT security, it was just so niche. We forget how niche that market was, right? And it was a bunch of dorks and geeks. And I mean, I'm a dork, I'm a geek, and usually the guys that were really good at it became salesmen. You know how the drill is. And so it wasn't necessarily the most attractive environment. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've sat on a cold floor in a data center, right? But now that technology has become more of our daily lives, and the sort of, I shall always say, the geekiness of it is kind of more attractive, because people now can see how technology can enable their lives, enable their businesses, and enable social interactions and help them do things. And I think now, since it's more part of our lives, this generation that's now, it's primed. And I think it's really important for us to acknowledge that it wasn't like we were keeping people out. I vividly remember in my very early days is seeking out people for different opinions, and so my core view on diversity really kind of comes down to life experience. I've always said, and to be really good at security, especially in pen testing, or if you really want to be good at security at all, you kind of have to think like a criminal. And if you're not a criminal, it's hard to think like one. And so, just like, law enforcement will talk to criminals in jail and interview them, learn their thinking process. You struggle to learn these sort of thought process to make you a better professional. And I think that's an extreme example of what diversity means for cybersecurity. I think it's a very dangerous area, because we're not making meaningful progress, and things are getting worse, in my humble opinion. Right, the hacks are getting bigger, the damages are getting more expansive. I mean, now we're having difficulty, dealing, ensuring emergency services are available. I mean, we've seen various hacks, that whether it be the recent one in France, or be the ones that affected NHS earlier this year, they're having tangible implications. So things are bad. So we need diversity in opinions and views, and how people challenge those around them, and how people think differently. And it's absolutely critical to the future of cybersecurity. And I think also we have to, and when I said dangers, I really mean is like, we have to be very mindful as folks that have been in this industry for a while, like yourself. And I know you spend a lot of time teaching and speaking. Like, a lot of guys have been doing this for a while, which is phenomenal. We also have to keep kind of one eye on the fact that we want to make sure that we're teaching an approach that allows people to apply their own imagination. So on a personal level, I will tell you that I take a lot of training in different aspects, whether it be, self-defense or whatever, but that part doesn't matter. And take a lot of training, and I'm talking to my instructor. It's like, okay, so do you mean I should do this or do it this way. And then and he'll say, well, if you do it that way, it means these pros and cons. You do it this way, these pros and cons. And he goes, well, do it the way that works best for you. Right. And I think that's the core attitude of what we as a profession need to do. As we're saying, it's like, okay, let's be cautious of hard, fast rules at a certain, I mean, at the beginning, there's clearly rules in cyber people need to learn. I'm not suggesting we don't do that, but I think we need to quickly identify those who are embracing the logic and the philosophies of cybersecurity, and then let them know that you can explore and experiment, right? And you and I, let's be honest, Jay, you and I, in the beginning of all this, it was all exploration. There were no rules, right? People were figuring it out day by day. And so that gave us an enormous amount of opportunity to innovate and explore different things. And we need to make sure that we're creating an environment for people coming through. And we need to make sure that we're doing everything in our power to embrace the different opinions that are coming into the industry. It's absolutely critical to the future of the industry and the future of what it means. I know I'm speaking in very big kind of global terms, but I thoroughly believe in diversity and cybersecurity is the only way we're going to move forward.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. And I think you've made some pretty interesting points in what you've just said, because I more or less got into IT as IT started. I mean, there was no internet. There were really no firewalls. And we evolved with IT. And I mean, I made mistakes. I was allowed to make those mistakes, though. I mean, I had a manager or a team around me that were equally as unsure of what the answers were, because nobody had the answers, because we'd never done it before.
100%.
So we could all learn by making mistakes. And I mean, I truly believe in life, that's how you do learn. You learn not from the things you do right, you learn from the things you do wrong. And I was very lucky to work for a number of pretty good, I don't even like referring to them as managers, but good leaders that enabled me to go in a direction that might not be right, and would kind of just slightly correct me or give me those pros and cons and let me make my own mind up. And therefore, I think when I first started out my career, it was a bit more fun, I guess, to work in IT. And I think there was certainly less pressure and less stress, because we were all walking a path that we had no idea where it was going to lead.
And we were making the path as we were walking it.
Absolutely. We were building the cars we were learning to drive, right? And I mentioned this to somebody actually yesterday, that it's easier when you've grown with IT to have a much broader knowledge of IT. And I'm not trying to be arrogant or say I know more than anyone else, but I was around when everything was command line, when you had to go into files to get Windows to run, when you had to get your sound card to work to play games, when you had to configure your network, it was all command line. We all got familiar with DOS, and that gave us a bit of a head start on being able to do networking, because switches were all command line. I was around for TCP/IP and IPX and BNC networks, and before Cat5 and then for Cat5. So you kind of layer on the knowledge, and therefore you could grow with it. And therefore now where I am today, when I try and learn something new, I have the base knowledge of learning that, because I can relate back to those things. But as you've said, technology is now everywhere. I mean, my girlfriend's daughter has just gone to university. She's 19 years old. She has a Mac. They've got Wi-Fi in the room. It's a gigabit internet. She's got her TV set up with on the internet to watch Netflix or Disney or any of those other streaming services. She's using her phone to pay for everything. She buys tickets on her phone. She goes to events by using her phone. It's absolutely everywhere. But I think that means that when people come in, because there's now so much pressure, people are not allowed to make the mistakes that they once did in the past. And people are frightened. It's definitely a lot more tense. And I can guarantee if you work in a cyber role and you are in a large company and you get compromised, you're having a difficult time. And I've spent a lot of time talking to boards of directors, and I've always said, it's not if we get compromised, it's when. Like, we can only keep the doors closed for a certain amount of time and they'll find a way in. So it's quite a stressful environment. So I guess I'm trying to get around to a question. I wonder if that stress and that kind of environment that we now have now, where people aren't allowed to mistakes, is what kind of leads to that cyber burnout. And I don't really want to call it cyber burnout because I see burnout across the whole of IT. I'd be curious to know what you think about cyber burnout. We've talked in the past, and I asked you if it was real, and you said it definitely is. But I'd be curious to know, firstly, where do you think it comes from? And secondly, how do we as leaders in that environment try to at least reduce it? I don't think we can eradicate it, but try and reduce it.
I want to, as a prelude to answering the question, I want to go back and comment about how you're able to make mistakes. And think about cyber today as if you make a mistake, it could mean businesses go down for extended periods, people lose jobs. And I got news for you. I mean, I was the one that brought internet to a company I was working for, and so if I shut it down, I vividly remember just shutting it down, not even thinking twice about it, right? It's crazy. But I think it's important that we keep that context in mind, and it plays back in even the conversation about diversity, right? Okay, so one is, I think the concept of burnout is certainly not an IT only or IT security only thing. It's all over the place, and it usually comes with any high pressure scenario that requires a lot of personal time, or just it's intense. You're focused on it all the time. What I would say is anybody who may not entirely believe in cybersecurity, pressures over time, hasn't really experienced them. And I will freely admit, I've been in my fair share of IT disasters, and all the way up to IT in cybersecurity disasters. Early in my career, there wasn't. You were a IT guy that knew security is really what it boiled down to back in the old days, because nobody. I remember vividly being given career advice by my vice president of the organization I was working for, saying, you need to get out of the security thing, get your CCIE. It's a waste of time, kind of thing, right? So it was a very different mindset back then. But for me is when I really learned about not just burnout, but what I think is the essence of burnout is that juxtaposition of the human condition between being someone there to help a scenario and try to unwind or deal with a cyber attack, which is very nebulous. It's not like, God forbid, a car accident and somebody's bleeding profusely, put a cat on it and get going, get to work, right? Whereas, especially when I was at Kivu, we focused on incident response, especially in dealing with ransomware and negotiations and all that kind of stuff. And I can't tell you, how many, times I was on the phone with people just absolutely crying, grown men and women, professionals of large companies, just falling apart. And as the team, and I just have this amazing respect for incident responders who are dealing with this on a regular basis, because you're just thrown into it, and you're having to deal with these high pressure scenarios. People's worlds are falling apart. And you're asked, like, they're looking at you on Zoom saying, what do I do? I'm going to lose my job. I'm going to lose my family. I'm going to lose my house. I'm going to lose my business. You're just like, wow. And so no matter how hard you try to separate yourself from that emotional involvement, it's almost impossible. So, when you have employees that are, having personal challenges and sacrifices that because of their job, but they do it because they care. It's a very tough situation. And I'm not saying that's unique to IR or incident respond people. You see it in SOC analysts, you see it at the CISO level, you see it at managers and VPs. And I'm not saying, again, not just with security, but I'm saying, for me, this is my world and I tend to associate with it, is you have this almost unknown at any point in time. Somebody can toss a grenade in the middle of your network, full stop, right? So you have this pending almost doom aspect of it to it all, right? And you feel like, how can I make things better? And so I find that people who are really in security, they wake up in the morning, they think security, they do some research, look at the news, go to work, and then work, and then they absolutely take their work home with them. And you see a lot of that in IT just in general. Again, not suggesting it doesn't exist in other industries, but I think there's a personal and human aspect that kind of gets lost. So the burnout's real. Again, I think it happens in a lot of areas. It just seems to be very acute in cybersecurity because it's all over the news now. It can happen at any point in time. And if there's a weakness that you missed, which there always will be, then there's this, whether between fear and guilt, and it's just an emotional process. And I think it's just getting worse, if I may be so bold.
Yeah, see, we did a podcast recently with Lisa Lorenzen, and we talked a little bit about cyber burnout because she took a bit of a step back from the role she was in because she was burnt out. I mean, and she said to us that she was in a very good position that she could do that, and many people aren't. But she said to us when we asked her the question that it was really to do with wanting to bring her A game every day and give 100%, and she could no longer do that. She was tired, she was worn out, she'd gone from kind of the stresses and the pressures of the pandemic, and then she needed to get on a plane like every week and go to events and talk and do all that kind of stuff. And she talked quite a lot about she felt that she wasn't doing enough. And I think a lot of people feel that. And it's not necessarily, I mean, I've been doing the role I'm in now for 10 months. I definitely felt like I was failing for 6 of those months. And imposter syndrome was kicking in, and I'd gone from a role where I was pretty confident and comfortable, and I built the environment, the IT environment, over a 12-year period. I had a lot of friends there. I had a big network, and I had the trust of the business. So if I, to be blunt, if I did make a big mistake, I had respect from the business, and also the 10 years or 12 years that I've been there, the history to go for them to be able to say, Jay's actually quite good at this. This was a one-off. Or if we got compromised, we know Jay's heart's in the right place. He tries to do everything we can. But there's a lot of talk about people moving all over the place now within a year, within 2 years. A CISO, I think, only spends like 2 years in a role.
Yeah, don't
Now,
tell me that.
Yeah.
I like my job.
So people go to a role, they don't really build the credibility for whatever reason, or the respect, or there's something going on, and they move on. And therefore, if there is a problem when they're there, they don't necessarily get the support they needed. And I mean, I knew I had that support. I knew if something gone wrong, which it did, we had problems, but I knew that people would stand by me and support me in that battle against the bad guys. I wasn't the bad guy. I was the guy trying to fight the bad guys, and I was doing everything I possibly could. And I mean, I would sit down with the board of directors and be like, I need more money. I think we've got issues here. The door's open over here. We need to do this. We need to do that. And I, quite often than not, it was a balancing act between how much they would give me and how many doors I could close. But I had that kind of support. And I wonder if that just doesn't exist now. And I wonder if that's something that companies need to start doing, is not blaming their IT and cyber teams if they get compromised, because most of those people are doing the best they can. And sometimes, in some cases, many people do take their work home. I mean, I got into IT because I love technology. I'm a geek, I'm a nerd, and I wanted to help people, as do most people that do this job. Because if you're not that kind of person, you'll do it for 6 months and think, this is too hard, I'm going somewhere else, because it is a non-stop job and it is a lot of pressure. So you really need to enjoy what you're doing. So I'm curious if companies just need to put their arms around people a bit and say, look, we've got you because we know you're fighting the right causes for us.
Jay, that's a really interesting thing, because yeah, it's hard to build, because for you to have built that respect and credibility over those 10 years, it's because there were times when those people failed and you were there to help them through a challenging time in some way, shape, or form. And so it takes time for people to trust people. I've always said, no matter how much you try to make things virtual, how much you try to make things technical, it's always about people interacting, right? And and I always used to say people buy from people, so whether, like my time at Optiv, and we would sell, tons of services and product, at the end of the day, it was a relationship that you formed with the purchasing person, because at the end of that day, you would somebody is making a decision, whether a hiring decision or whatever, or an investment decision, even at the board level or CEO or senior leader, is they're stamping their name and their career on it. Okay. And so it's just like everything, it all kind of moves downhill. And I find that, and I can say this about the IT and IT security world only because I've lived it. I'm sure it exists in other industries, but there's this overwhelming sense of not letting people down. You don't want the bad guy to win. And I think some companies recognize that character and try to embrace people sooner in the process, to your point earlier. I think what's going to happen, I guess the point I'm trying to make is it takes time to build human relationships to where it's okay. Jay means well, or yeah, Jim may have screwed up, but we're not going to hold Jim fully accountable, kind of thing. We'll just, whatever, wrap his knuckles. So, but I think since that takes so much time to learn, time to develop, because we're just human, is I think it's also about having companies understand that, to your point earlier, it's not if, when, okay? And there is no perfect set of defenses. You can't protect everything all the time. You can't do it equally. You can only do what you can do. And unfortunately, attackers have an infinite amount of time and energy where you have to defend against all those. They need one, all the, insert, common security phraseology here. But I think is we have to begin to start preparing organizations more effectively. I know we do it through risk assessments. I know we do it through threat intelligence. And we're always saying things are going to happen and you need to spend money. I think what it is we need to help them understand is not necessarily teach them, but help articulate in ways that translate to the broader aspects of business risk. Let me tell you something. I'm going to make a point here that I've made a number of times, and if you don't mind, I'm going to use this opportunity to say it one more time. Is there's this overwhelming sense I see in security leadership today that security is the center of the world, and the board just doesn't understand it, kind of thing. First of all, CEOs, executives, and the board, let me tell you, they know risk, full stop. Okay. They're dealing with challenges and liabilities that a lot of senior security leaders have actually zero visibility into, right? So first is recognizing you're part of a risk and liability ecosystem when it comes to the senior executive team. When you realize that you're part of it, then it's less about, oh, they don't know and I need to teach them and talk to them like they're stupid. No, is we need to learn their language of risk so we're able to juxtapose relatively complex issues in ways that they can then not just understand, but also digest within the larger risk-making decision process against their own, levels of risk appetite. So where am I going with this is basically the needs of leadership in this particular space is being able to not just simply articulate, but to understand that these things are going to happen. There is no silver bullet. And I know it sounds very sort of old school, but for people to be effective in their job, they need to know it's okay to make mistakes. That's it, full stop. And that's what doesn't quite exist today. And because it doesn't exist today, people burn themselves out. They think they run to another job, or shall I say, run away from their current job to another one, when in fact you should always be running to a job, never away from a job, right? And so I think that's the ultimate thing is people in leadership positions beyond IT and security, up above, if you will, recognizing that it's going to happen. So how do we, minimize that and take the best of our team and understand they're doing their best and doing and making those proper actions? It's a very difficult thing to articulate. I'm sorry if I'm babbling a little bit.
No, I think you made the point perfectly. I mean, I'm hoping, because cyber is relatively new in regard to kind of IT, it kind of spawned out of IT and cyber became a thing. So I think at some point we're gonna come to like the tipping point and things are gonna have to change, because otherwise we won't be able to fill roles. People will be moving every 3 months. There'll be, I mean, ransomware is on the rise and all of these things are rising. So it's not going to get any easier. I think we're getting to that point where things are going to change. But I'm looking at the time and I'm seeing that time's ticking. It's been great talking to you. I want to kind of ask you a couple more questions before we wrap. So I'll ask you kind of if you could advise, so it's kind of a twofold question. If you could go back and advise your 18-year-old self something from today, what would you do? What would your advice be? And also, if you were 18 today, trying to get into the kind of cyber environment, what would that advice be? And it might be the same advice, it might be different advice.
Oh my gosh, wow, that's really hard. There's literally a gazillion things, right? So I think if I could go back in time and tell myself something, it probably have nothing to do with career. It'd have to do with like, that decision you made when you were 24, that kind of stuff, right? But my gut reaction to that is, be very entrepreneurial. I didn't recognize in the generation that I was, or we were for that matter, is the birth of the internet and just how amazing it would become, versions 1, 2, and 3 and all that kind of junk. And and it was the wild, wild west. I mean, I'm sure we both have some pretty bonker stories. I mean, I got tons of them. And and still to this day, I go, yeah, well, I wrote an article about that in 1994. You just like, man, I just should have got ahead of it. So my advice to me when I was younger is recognize the craziness that you're going into. Because remember, in the 80s, I was looking at my grandparents going, man, they were there at the invention or proliferation of the vehicle all the way through to watching us go to the moon and the space shuttle. I'll never be like that. And little did I know the internet was going to represent just this massive social and global change that we see today. So I really should have embraced that more deeply, right? But I did get lucky and find security early in my career, so I didn't screw up too bad. What I tell an 18-year-old today, that actually, that for me, that's a lot more responsibility. I'm always afraid of taking my old guy views and trying to put it on the young. So, because I've had that happen to be a lot, by the way. I would say is there's still opportunities to be a wonderful entrepreneur. I mean, there's so many interesting things happening. I'm not saying that the internet boom is over. Digitization, all the sort of transformation activities are happening. I would say if you're 18, the whole world is changing, right? So how we're looking at energy production and consumption and politics and social and how technology plays a role in that. Obviously, I would say is, there are some sciences that are worth digging into. And I still think computer science is a big one. I would really jump into um, quantum computing. If I was 18 right now, I would go bonkers on quantum computing. I think that's where it's all going for good, bad, indifference. Whatever you think it's going to be, all I know is it's going to be big. And there's a very itty bitty tiny community that really understands that deeply from a practicality standpoint. There's plenty of science and theoretical science on quantum mechanics and quantum computing, but people at Google and IBM and HP and all these guys that are making quantum computers, that's where the heart of the future is in my mind, for good or for bad. But that's where I would focus my energy.
I think that's some good advice in both counts. So I'm going to ask you two kind of fun questions that are close to my heart before we wrap.
Okay.
And John's going to laugh when he listens to this. Question number one is, what's the best meal you've ever had? And question two is, what would your dream vacation be?
Okay. Wow. Best meal I've ever had. It was me and my wife went to Mexico. We stayed at this really amazing place, and they pulled a redfish out of the sea and made fish tacos for us. And it was between the location, being there with my beautiful wife, and eating that. That was the best meal ever. Oh, I'm sorry. What was the second question? I apologize.
Dream vacation.
Best vacation. Oh my gosh, it's the same thing. Actually, I don't know. I think I always wanted to go to Aruba and go windsurfing. I grew up windsurfing and that kind of stuff. Or I do a lot of horseback riding. So I would love to. I've had horses. I'm a huge horse guy. So I think I'd rode horses, and I'd like to go back to the snowy mountains in Australia and go riding again, or maybe Montana, something like a horseback vacation, maybe even intermingle that with some horseback hunting, maybe some elk hunting. I think that would just be amazing, honestly.
See, funnily enough, there's not a lot in life I'm scared of. I'm scared of scorpions because just don't like them. And there's a story to that. My friend had a scorpion tank, and they all fell out once when we were kids, and we couldn't find them, and it scared me.
It's the little ones you got to be afraid of. That's for sure.
And horses. A friend of mine when we were really, really young had a horse, and she got kicked by it when she was cleaning it out, and it put me off
Mm.
horses forever. And I've been on the back of one, but they frightened me. Um, but anyway, I think that's a wrap. I mean, it's been absolutely awesome to speak to you. Um, I'm a little bit gutted that John's not here to participate, but that does mean that we'll have to come back and do it again. I'd really like to talk with you about kind of the role of the CISO and who they should report to, but that's a whole topic in itself. But I really appreciate you coming on. It's been brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jay. It's been a joy, and I would love to be able to come back. But it was fun talking. I really appreciate the opportunity. I really do. Thank you so much.
Brilliant. Thank you.